Hiya. He has 10 newspapers where these Jews are pushing this 6 million figure between the years of 1915 and 1938. The first newspaper is The Sun of New York. New York, June the 6th, 1915. That is The Sun. It's the first page of the 5th section that I want. And there we go. The Sun. It's a bit ripped along there, it's all come off a bit. The 5th section. It's the front page. And the article is called Horrors Worse than Kishinev, Charged Against Russia Today. And there's the big article. Takes up most of the page. So go in. Yeah. Go. Since the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the Jewish people have had no darker page in their history than that which the Russian government is writing today. 6 million Jews, one half of the Jewish people throughout the world, are being persecuted, hounded, humiliated, tortured, starved. Thousands of them have been slaughtered. Hundreds of thousands of Jews, old men, women and children, are being driven mercilessly from town to town. There it is, people. 6 million Jews. One half of the Jewish people throughout the world are being persecuted, hounded, humiliated, tortured and starved. As I go along here, support here as well. Dear brethren, have mercy on the 6 million Jews in Russia and take our part. Once again, 6 million Jews in Russia. 6 million. This is in an article entitled Horrors Worse than Kishinev, Charged Against Russia Today. That's in The Sun of New York, Sunday, June the 6th, 1915. This is 18 years before Hitler ever set foot in the government. 18 years.
He was holding in his hand the book of Adolf Hitler, Ymach Shemo, Mankind, translated to Hebrew. And he started to read from the book why Hitler hated Jews. You're not going to believe it.
This is the next newspaper. This is the New York Times again. It's from 1918. There it is, the New York Times, October the 18th, 1918.
Anyone seeking the victor's version of World War II need only watch any Hollywood movie, turn on the TV to any World War II documentary, or visit any public library.
Ladies and gentlemen, you are about to hear a very frightening speech. This speech is an explanation of the plans now being laid to throw the United States into a third world war.
There it is. 6 million souls will need help to resume normal life when war is ended. 6 million souls.
The German nation lost by conquest all our organically grown institutions.
Mass meeting hears that 127,000 Jews have been killed and 6 million are in peril.
This is not a Jewish meeting. This is the conscience of America making itself felt.
It was international Zionism that wanted to destroy Germany and Hitler.
And what I tell you now concerns not only you, but your children and the survival of this country and Christianity. Well, I don't want to go by what they were called. We're now using English words, and what they were called in Germany is not very material, but they were communists because in 1917, the communists took over Germany for a few days. Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht and a group of Jews in Germany took over the government for 3 days. In fact, when the Kaiser ended the war, he fled to Holland because he thought the communists were going to take over Germany as they did Russia, and that he was going to meet the same fate that the Tsar did in Russia. So he left and went to Holland for safety, for security. At that time, when the communist threat in Germany was quashed, it was quiet, the Jews were working still, trying to get back into their former status, and the Germans fought them in every way they could without hurting a hair on anyone's head. The same as one group, the prohibitionists, fought the people who were interested in liquor, and they didn't fight one another with pistols. They did it every way they could. Well, that's the way they were fighting the Jews in Germany. And at that time, mind you, there were 80 to 90 million Germans, and there were only 460,000 Jews. Less than 1% of the population of Germany were Jews. And yet, they controlled all the press, they controlled most of the economy, because they had come in and with cheap money, you know the way the mark was devalued, they bought up practically everything. Well, in 1933, when Germany refused to surrender, mind you, to the World Conference of Jews in Amsterdam, they broke up, and Mr. Untermeyer came back to the United States, who was the head of the American delegation and the president of the whole conference, and he went from the steamer to ABC and made a radio broadcast throughout the United States in which he said, "The Jews of the world now declare a holy war against Germany. We are now engaged in a sacred conflict against the Germans, and we are going to starve them into surrender. We are going to use a worldwide boycott against them that will destroy them because they are dependent upon their export business." And it is a fact that 2/3 of Germany's food supply had to be imported, and it could only be imported with the proceeds of what they exported, their labor. So if Germany could not export, 2/3 of Germany's population would have to starve. There just was not enough food for more than 1/3 of a population. Now, in this declaration, which I have here, it was printed and a whole page in the New York Times on August 7th, 1933, Mr. Samuel Untermeyer boldly stated that this economic boycott is our means of self-defense. President Roosevelt has advocated its use in the NRA, which some of you may remember, where everybody was to be boycotted unless they followed the rules laid down by the New Deal, which of course was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court at that time. Nevertheless, the Jews of the world declared a boycott against Germany, and it was so effective that you couldn't find one thing in any store anywhere in the world with the words "Made in Germany" on it.
January 30th, 1933. Adolf Hitler is appointed Chancellor of Germany. The former Austrian soldier and statesman is now a major figure in a coalition government. Hitler was appointed by Paul von Hindenburg, the second-elect president of the German Weimar Republic. After having dissolved the Reichstag twice in 1932, Hindenburg was ultimately the one to secure the National Socialist Party's power, even though he was personally opposed to Hitler. Hindenburg was not only a Lutheran Protestant, but a direct descendant of Martin Luther and his wife, Katharina von Bora, through their daughter, Margaret Luther. Like Hitler, Hindenburg was a military man and statesman, having served in the Austro-Prussian 7 Weeks' War of 1866 and the Franco-German War of 1870, and retiring in 1911. He was called back to service in 1914 as the superior of expert strategist Major General Erich Ludendorff. Their success earned Hindenburg even more public acclaim, and he was promoted to the rank of Field Marshal and eventually command all land forces. Hindenburg had known the struggle of later dealing with left-wing radical uprisings throughout Germany, but still had his share of criticism for the Republican view. He retired again in 1919, viewed largely as a nonpartisan. But in 1925 came the death of Friedrich Ebert. Paul von Hindenburg became the second president of the Weimar Republic. He ran again in 1932, seen as the only candidate who could defeat Adolf Hitler. Centrist Catholics and Social Democrats kept Hindenburg in office, but Hitler's movement was not to be denied and would prove useful, even if unpleasant, as allies. 2 governments were emerging. The first, led by Franz von Papen, a wealthy Westphalian Catholic scion and diplomat who helped dissolve the Weimar government. Papen was a soldier in World War I and military attaché in Washington, D.C., to the German ambassador. As a diplomat to the U.S. and Mexico, Papen assisted the Mexican government in procuring arms for the Victoriano Huerta administration, which collapsed soon after. He had done the same in Germany, purchasing weapons during the First World War. On the 22nd of August, 1914, a series of bombings against Allied supporting New York City businesses were carried out, led by Detective Paul Koenig, who was hired by Papen. With massive donations coming from Berlin, Franz opened a front company and preclusively purchased hydraulic presses to prevent artillery shell production, and also produced fake passports for Germans to leave for home. The second party, led by Kurt von Schleicher, last Chancellor of the Weimar Republic, who pushed for a more authoritative regime. Schleicher was a former army officer, an opponent of Hitler and Heinrich Brüning, the foreign minister and man responsible for dissolving the Reichstag. Neither party would be able to win the support of the National Socialists. Hitler demanded to be chancellor of any government in which he and his party were involved, but Hindenburg would not concede. However, in November of 1932, Papen and Hitler agreed on a government, with Hitler as chancellor, Papen as vice-chancellor. With Schleicher's efforts for parliamentary support losing steam, Hindenburg called for his resignation. On January 30, 1933, Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as chancellor. His cabinet only consisting of 2 National Socialists, Wilhelm Frick and Hermann Göring. The modern-day belief is that Adolf Hitler began immediately suppressing rights of Jews in Germany, but no sanctioned campaigns occurred. The violence that did occur was already ongoing and were principally because of the Jewish involvement in World War I. At this time, Hitler was not the undisputed ruler of Germany. He was not yet in control of the military, and would not be until a consolidation of power that occurred later. February 14, 1933, the Central Association of German Citizens of Jewish Faith released a statement voicing their concern for Hitler and offering support for Hindenburg. Nevertheless, we are convinced that no one will dare to violate our constitutional rights. Zentralverein Deutscher Staatsbürger Jüdischen Glaubens, or Central Association of German Citizens of Jewish Faith, began in 1893, founded to promote Jewish social equality and protect from anti-Semitism. Much of their energy was spent attempting to dispel the ages-old idea that they were part of an international Jewish syndicate. 2 weeks after the statement, the Krefeld chapter held an event titled The Future of the German Jews, featuring Julius Brodnitz and Arthur Sandelovsky. Multiple incidents were reported in the surrounding days of the event, such as windows being smashed and even gunfire. The February 23rd issue of Zentralverein Zeitung reported of the event. Brodnitz and Sandelovsky stressed, "There is not the slightest reason to depart from our association's basic principles. Our deep inner bond with both German culture and Judaism should help us overcome all the difficulties besetting us. Brodnitz died a few years later, in 1936, as a result of a concussion suffered in an automobile accident. He had 3 sons, one being Otto Brodnitz, who is employed by investment banker Louis Frank Rothschild, a graduate of Columbia University and partner of Leonard A. Hochstadter from Kuhn and Loeb, the firm that funded much of the First World War. Rothschild was married to Cora Guggenheim of the famed Guggenheim family. But even the Central Verein did not believe that the new government was inciting anti-Jewish uprisings, stating, "We do not believe our German fellow citizens will let themselves be carried away into committing excesses against the Jews." But this was not enough for the Jewish community. They wanted war.
Wahlkampf, der Verfall unserer Kultur, diese Welle von Verpestung unseres ganzen kulturellen Lebens, der Zersetzung unserer Literatur, der Vergiftung unseres Theaters, der Kino, die ganze Kunst, sie wird nun langsam vernarrt. Millionen unserer deutschen Volksgenossen nehmen gar keinen Anteil mehr. Sie sagt ihnen nichts mehr. Diese Kunst, die nicht aus unserem Volk geboren worden ist, sondern die uns fremd ist und fremd bleiben wird, die nichts mit deutschem Wesen zu tun hat und nicht aus unserer Seele kam, die ist nur durch eine geschäftige Presse unserem Volk aufoktroyiert worden, mundgerecht gemacht worden. Und parallel damit beginnt der Angriff gegen die Erziehung unserer Jugend, die Vergiftung der kleinen Kindergehirne schon, das Herausreißen aller Erinnerungen an unsere deutsche Vergangenheit, die Beschimpfung aller großen Männer unseres Volkes, das Entfernen der Erinnerung an sie aus den Herzen und aus dem Gehirn dieser kleinen deutschen Jugend und damit im Großen eine Besudelung der deutschen Geschichte überhaupt. Nichts, was einst groß war, nichts, was mitgeholfen hat, diesen Staat und dieses Volk zu begründen, stark zu machen, wurde nun verschont von diesen zersetzenden und zerfressenden Angriffen. Alles heruntergezogen, angefangen von den Symbolen der Vergangenheit, von Kokarden und Fahnen, bis zu den großen Männern unserer Geschichte.
March 4, 1933. The United States inaugurates Franklin Delano Roosevelt as the 32nd president. His speech was heard by tens of millions of anxious Americans, desperate for hope, at the height of the Great Depression. March 12, the American Jewish Congress announced a protest at New York City's Madison Square Garden, scheduled for the 27th. A call for an American boycott of all German goods raged throughout New York and other major cities. March 23rd, 20,000 rally at New York City Hall and shipping stations for North German Lloyd and Hamburg, America.
Dr. Stephen S. Wise, rabbi of the Free Synagogue and the national leader of liberal thought, speaks in behalf of the Jews of the United States.
This is not a Jewish meeting. This is the conscience of America making itself felt.
The next day, on the 24th, London's Daily Express releases the famed headline, "Judea declares war on Germany. Jews of all the world unite. Boycott of German goods." The whole of Israel throughout the world is uniting to declare an economic and financial war on Germany. The appearance of the swastika as the symbol of the new Germany has revived the old war symbol of Judas to new life. 14 million Jews scattered over the entire world are tied to each other, as if one man in order to declare war against the German persecutors of their fellow believers. The Jewish wholesaler will quit his house, the banker his stock exchange, the merchant his business, and the beggar his humble hut, in order to join the holy war against Hitler's people. From the Jewish publication, Not a Wretch. The war against Germany will be waged by all Jewish communities, conferences, congresses, by every individual Jew. Thereby, the war against Germany will ideologically enliven and promote our interests, which require that Germany be wholly destroyed. The danger for us Jews lies in the whole German people, in Germany as a whole, as well as individually. It must be rendered harmless for all time. In this war, we Jews have to participate, and this with all the strength and might we have at our disposal. March 26. The Zionist Association of Germany releases a telegram calling the Jewish accusations against National Socialist Germany sensational and mendacious. For many Zionists, the National Socialist regime was exactly what they needed to encourage mass immigration to Palestine. Journalist Klaus Polkehn authored in The Secret Contacts, Zionism and Nazi Germany, 1933 to 1941, published in the Journal of Palestine, that the financial success of National Socialism would play a pivotal role in the establishment of a Jewish state, and that this little-known fact would shed a new light onto the real relationship between Nazi Germany and the Jews. German Foreign Minister Konstantin von Neurath maintained the position that Germany was the aggressor. As concerns Jews, I can only say that their propagandists abroad are rendering their co-religionists in Germany no service by giving the German public, through their distorted and untruthful news about persecution and torture of Jews, the impression that they actually halt at nothing, not even at lies and calumny, to fight the present German government. But even U.S. Secretary of State and man responsible for the establishment of the United Nations, Cordell Hull, said in a telegram to Rabbi Stephen Wise of the American Jewish Congress, whereas there was for a short time considerable physical mistreatment of Jews, this phase may be considered virtually terminated. A stabilization appears to have been reached in the field of personal mistreatment. I feel hopeful that the situation which has caused such widespread concern throughout this country will soon revert to normal. Despite the conflicting opinions and cautions, the Jews wanted nothing short of war. March 27, massive protests in New York City, Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Cleveland, and cities across the country, calling for action against a new Germany. All of this occurred before Hitler ever called for a boycott on Jewish goods. Hitler's response would come in a speech on March 28, 4 days after the Jews declared war on Germany. Now that the domestic enemies of the nation have been eliminated by the Volk itself, what we have long been waiting for will not come to pass. The communist and Marxist criminals and their Jewish intellectual instigators who, having made off with their capital stocks across the border in the nick of time, are now unfolding an unscrupulous, treasonous campaign of agitation against the German Volk as a whole from there. Lies and slander of positively hair-raising perversity are being launched about Germany. Horror stories of dismembered Jewish corpses, gouged out eyes, and hacked off hands are circulating for the purpose of defaming the German Volk in the world for the second time, just as they had succeeded in doing once before in 1914. Many historians will point out that this boycott order was the firing shot from Hitler and the National Socialists, leading to the beginning of the war. But few will recognize that this order was in response to the declaration of war on Germany just days before. It is this fact that prevents many people worldwide from understanding the real series of events that would lead to the devastation soon to follow. The boycott and response harshly affected global trade, and according to author Edwin Black, cut German exports by 10%, and that some countries were seizing German assets. Months later in Amsterdam, the World Jewish Economic Federation organized and employed worldwide boycotts and political strategies. Serving as president, New York attorney Samuel Untermyer. Germany, been converted from a nation of culture into a veritable hell of cruel and savage beasts. We owe it not only to our persecuted brethren, but to the entire world to now strike in self-defense a blow that will free humanity from a repetition of this incredible outrage. Now or never must all the nations of the earth make common cause against the slaughter, starvation, and annihilation, fiendish torture, cruelty, and persecution that are being inflicted day by day upon these men, women, and children. When the tale is told, the world will confront a picture so fearful in its barbarous cruelty that the hell of war and the alleged Belgian atrocities pale into insignificance as compared to this devilishly, deliberately, cold-bloodedly planned and already partially executed campaign for the extermination of a proud, gentle, loyal, law-abiding people. The Jews are the aristocrats of their world. From time immemorial, they have been persecuted and have seen their persecutors come and go. They alone have survived. And so will history repeat itself. But that furnishes no reason why we should permit this reversion of a once great nation to the Dark Ages, or fail to rescue these 600,000 human souls from the tortures of hell. What we are proposing, and have already gone far toward doing, is to prosecute a purely defensive economic boycott that will undermine the Hitler regime and bring the German people to their senses by destroying their export trade on which their very existence depends. We propose to, and are organizing world opinion to express itself in the only way Germany can be made to understand. The Hitler regime originated and are fiendishly prosecuting their boycott to exterminate the Jews by placarding Jewish shops, warning Germans against dealing with them, by imprisoning Jewish shopkeepers and parading them through the streets by the hundreds under guard of Nazi troops for the sole crime of being Jews, by ejecting them from the learned professions in which many of them had attained eminence, by excluding their children from the schools, their men from the labor unions, closing against them every avenue of livelihood, locking them in vile concentration camps, and starving and torturing them without cause, and resorting to every other conceivable form of torture, inhuman beyond conception, until suicide has become their only means of escape, and all solely because they are, or their remote ancestors were, Jews, and all with the avowed object of exterminating them. What the world did not know at the time was that the International Zionists and the National Socialists would be quietly cooperating in an agreement to send Jews to Palestine.
Live on Channel 5, this is the 10 o'clock news with Deborah Norville.
Coming out revealing secret negotiation between the Nazis and the Zionists in 1933, which allowed German Jews and their assets to go to Palestine. Rich Samuels joins us tonight with the story of the controversy behind the book and the author's struggle to write it. Rich?
Deborah, with the rise of Adolf Hitler to power in the spring of 1933, the Jews of the world were faced with a dilemma. They could raise a cry of protest, a cry few would heed, or they could make a deal with Hitler, a deal that would bring a step closer their dream of an independent Jewish state. The choice they made was difficult and agonizing. This new book describes that choice. The book is called The Transfer Agreement.
About the Holocaust.
Edwin Black, to fill the void left by the silence of his parents, has written this book, a dense, detailed chronicle of the early months of 1933. January 30th, 1933. Hitler becomes Germany's interim chancellor. The Third Reich has begun. But in this country, on March 4th, attention is diverted by the inauguration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
More power to you, President Roosevelt. The entire country's behind you, thrilled with hope and patriotism.
But ominous headlines tell what's already happening to the Jews of Germany. The protest of American Jews was heard almost immediately. It was based on only the sparsest of press reports.
Thousands who waited hours behind police lines rushed forward as the doors of Madison Square Garden are open. Jews and Gentiles join in the race for seats, and 22,000 of them get in.
I was a young kid then, you see. I was a teenager. And I belonged to a Zionist youth group. And we were all summoned to go to that rally. Well, it was a very agitated crowd. Many Yiddish speaking, a few English speaking. And Rabbi Wise mounted an appeal to the Jewish people to do something to save Jewish honor.
The conscience of Nazi Germany made itself felt 5 days later. 5 days later.
At the time of Hitler's rise, Zionists were but a small minority of Germany's Jews. Jews made up only 0.76% of the population, or roughly 500,000. One of the most prominent Jewish voices at the time was that of the non-Zionist Central Union of German Citizens of the Jewish Faith. This organization produced a resolution in April of 1921 and concluded it with the words, "If the work for settlement in Palestine were nothing more than a task of aid and assistance, then from the point of view of the Central Verein, nothing would be said against the promotion of this work. However, the settlement in Palestine is in the first place an object of national Jewish policy, and hence its promotion and support should be rejected." In a 1930 edition of Süddeutsche Monatshefte, Gerhard Hodheim wrote, "The Zionist program encompasses the conception of a homogeneous, indivisible Jewry on a national basis. The criterion for Jewry is hence not a confession of religion, but the all-embracing sense of belonging to a racial community that is bound together by ties of blood and history and which is determined to keep its national individuality." Head of the National Socialist Office of Foreign Affairs, Alfred Rosenberg, agreed. "Zionism must be vigorously supported so that a certain number of German Jews is transported annually to Palestine, or at least made to leave the country." Many liberal Jews felt that the Zionists were also stabbing them in the back by stirring up more anti-Semitism. But the Zionists saw this as an opportune moment. Hitler's influence was only growing, and the idea of stripping Jews of their citizenship, as well as removing them from all public office, was a reality that would be the push they needed towards Palestine. German-American and Vice Chairman of the World Jewish Congress, Rabbi Dr. Joachim Prinz, called Hitler's rise to power the beginning of the Jews' return to this Judaism. "No hiding place hides us any longer. Instead of assimilation, we wish for the recognition of the Jewish nation and the Jewish race." Years later, while protesting for civil rights for blacks in the United States, Prince spoke directly before Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech. By the beginning of April, Jewish stores began to be ransacked, and Germany's universities removed over 2,000 Jewish scientists. Not a word said by the Zionist Congress, which would meet later that summer. April 18, the German Student Union announces nationwide action against the un-German spirit. On the same day, the Student Union released their 12 Theses, symbolic of Martin Luther's 95 Theses, and burning of the Papal Bull. These 12 Theses called for the establishment of a national German language and the elimination of Jewish influence in the universities. May 6, the German Student Union raids the library of Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute of Sexual Research, covered in Episode 4. Books, journals, and films about homosexuality, transsexuality, and various records of abortions, sex reassignment surgeries, and other perversions were destroyed. A few days later, on May 10, more than 25,000 books were burned in the square of the State Opera Bebelplatz, named for famed German socialist August Bebel, a Gentile sympathetic to the Jewish, gay, and minority cause. Bebel was a follower of Marxist Wilhelm Liebknecht, father of Karl Liebknecht, founder of the German Communist Party and Spartacusbund, along with Marxist Rosa Luxemburg.
Wir haben nicht nur die gefahrlosen, wir haben auch die gefährlichen Probleme angepasst. Wir haben nicht aus Angst vor dem Weltjudentum den Griff ins jüdische Wespennest in Deutschland unterlassen. Wir haben die Juden aus dem öffentlichen Leben herausgefegt. Sie können nicht mehr auf den Bühnen oder im Film oder in den Zeitungen im Namen des deutschen Volkes reden. Sie haben kein Recht mehr, die deutsche Nation zu repräsentieren. Man schaue sich im Lager unserer Feinde um. Wohin man blickt, Juden über Juden. Juden hinter Roosevelt als sein Gehirntröst. Juden hinter Churchill als seine Einbläser. Juden als Hetzer und Einpfeifer der gesamten englisch-amerikanisch-sowjetischen Presse. Juden in den dunklen Winkeln des Kreml als die wirklichen Träger des Bolschewismus. Der internationale Jude ist der Gift, der die feindliche Koalition zusammenhält. Der schlägt durch seine weltumfassenden Beziehungen die Brücken zwischen Moskau, London und Washington. Wir stehen hier dem gefährlichsten Feind der Welt gegenüber. Von ihm geht der Krieg aus, er führt ihn aus dem Hintergrunde an, aber er ist nicht unüberwindlich. Wir haben gegen diese terroristische jüdische Welteroberungsidee im Inneren unseres Reiches 14 Jahre lang unter den denkbar ungünstigsten Umständen gekämpft. Wie wir ihn einmal im Inneren zu Fall gebracht haben, so werden wir seine Macht, die uns nun von außen bedroht, zum Sturz bringen.
Just a year before, in May of 1932, the establishment of anti-fascist action became the news circulation of the Anti-Fascists, or Antifa, a communist-minded militant organization that had risen up out of the Weimar era, an offshoot of the Communist Party, or KPD. Led by Ernst Thälmann, the KPD were Stalinists, or Soviet loyalists, controlled by Comintern. After Thälmann's official John Wittorf was found to be stealing funds from the KPD, Thälmann attempted a cover-up, but was later removed, only to have Stalin himself intervene and reinstate him. That same year, Thälmann was the party's presidential candidate, receiving less than half the votes of Hitler. Thälmann called for the KPD and the Social Democratic Party to organize a strike to remove Hitler. After an unsuccessful attempt, he then called for violent overthrow. This, amongst a host of other things, led to the next year's worth of fighting between German National Socialists and Antifa. Thälmann was arrested in March of 1933 and imprisoned. He later declared that he had been severely whipped. He spent 11 years in solitary confinement and was executed in Buchenwald in August of 1944. Others arrested were members of the Roter Front Kampfverbund, or Alliance of Red Front Fighters, and other communist militant groups coming out of Weimar. These groups often engaged in violence with police and political rivals. These would be some of the first arrested and incarcerated by the Germans, whose anger was directly aimed at these communists that they believed had cost them the previous war and millions of lives. Those who avoided capture escaped and joined foreign communist militant groups like Centuria, Thälmann, or the International Brigades, who were involved with Comintern to influence the Spanish Republic during the Spanish Civil War. Their fight with the Nazis were soon to officially begin again. While many of these splinter groups fought, or at least claimed to fight fascism, the Zionists did not. On the 1st of March, 1933, the SA occupied Central Verein and shut it down. The National Socialists would also ban groups like the new Zionist organizations, such as the Reichsleague of Jewish Veterans and the Union of National German Jews, both nationalist groups, a curious move that allowed for the Zionist position to flourish in what was otherwise a non-Zionist Jewish community. The Reich Deputation of German Jews convened in the fall of 1933, involving most major German Jewish groups. At its head, Dr. Rabbi Leo Beck, a reformist Jew, respected by conservatives, liberals, Orthodox Zionists, and non-Zionists, which worked as an advantage to the Zionists, who now could reach the nation of Jewry. This union took place with little to no interference from the state. In fact, the National Socialist Party allowed all kinds of political activity. A statement from the Bavarian political police in July of 1935 noted, "The Zionist organizations have for some time been collecting donations from their members and sympathizers with the intention of promoting immigration, the buying of land in Palestine, and the gaining of support for settlement in Palestine. These collections do not require government permission as they are held in closed Jewish circles. Moreover, on the part of the state police, there is no objection against these arranged meetings since they deal with such funds as are meant to promote the practical solution of the Jewish problem." Most of this Zionist propaganda, in particular the Jüdische Rundschau, operated under the eye of the Ministry of Propaganda, while social democratic and communist publications were banned. Jerusalem correspondent for the Allgemeine Zeitung, Winfried Martini, commented that of all the papers, it was the Jewish press which held freedoms that the non-Jewish publications did not, adding that the Jewish periodical, Jüdische Rundschau, the largest Jewish periodical in Germany, often featured pieces that were highly critical of the Nazis, without fear of being banned, leading to an upward growth of the paper during this time. According to Martini, this led to a steady conversion to Zionism, even by way of criticizing fascism. The Jüdische Rundschau was co-edited by Hungarian Jewish journalist Robert Welch, longtime correspondent for Haaretz, friend of Albert Einstein, and whose cousin Felix Welch was a close friend of Arthur Franz Kafka. Their stance on the Jewish boycott, although not in direct support of the Jews, appeared to affirm their Zionist positions. The fatal error of many Jews that one can represent Jewish interests under another cloak is removed. In fact, Zionist publications were permitted to operate well into the late 1930s, like Jüdisch Verlag and Schocken Verlag in Berlin. A few years before, in 1929, an association of second-generation farmers in the Mashavot of Palestine was forming a movement to promote their economic, social, security, and cultural interests. Their funding provided by the B'nai Binyamin Cooperative Bank, which had opened only a few years before that, in 1924, and released a publication of their own in the same year. This movement became known as the B'nai Binyamin Movement. Romanian author and activist Alexander Aronson became their president. His brother and sister, Aaron and Sarah, were founders of the Jewish espionage network known as Nili, which aided the United Kingdom against the Ottoman Empire in Palestine from 1915 to 1917. Nili stands for Netza Yisrael Lo Yeshakar, or the Eternal One of Israel will not lie. They were arrested and tortured. Sarah committed suicide days after. B'nai Binyamin was a name of tribute to Jewish lawyer, activist, father of modern political Zionism, and banker, Binyamin Ze'ev, or Theodor Herzl. Habron Avraham Edmund Benjamin, or Edmund James de Rothschild, later financed the first site at Rishon LeZion. He also established the Palestine Jewish Colonization Association, or PICA. Funding and support for B'nai Binyamin came from the USA as well. Nathan Strauss of Abraham and Strauss and R.H. Macy and Company was a prominent member and is the namesake for the Israeli city of Netanya. The Strauss family had earned their fortune from crockery and glassware and owned slaves until the defeat of the Confederacy. Nathan donated much of his life to Zionism and health issues in Palestine, and had served as president of the Board of Health and commissioner of the Department of Health and Parks Commissioner in New York City. Backed by B'nai Binyamin, a Jewish citrus company based in Netanya, called Hanotea, negotiated agreements with the Reich's economic ministry. Jewish bank accounts frozen by the Reichs would be unblocked on the condition that funds would be used by Hanotea to purchase German agricultural goods, which were struggling worldwide due to the international Jewish boycott. The goods and the account owners would be transferred to Palestine, where groups like B'nai Binyamin and Strauss had funded settlements.
Across the Reich, Hitler's troops shut down Jewish-owned businesses for 24 hours. Within days, American Jews marched calling for the boycott of all German exports. Jews throughout Europe echoed that call, so did Jews everywhere. But a group of Zionists at the same time was quietly negotiating an agreement with the Nazis to allow the immigration of German Jews and the transfer of their assets to Palestine. That deal, reported in August 1933, was the transfer agreement. Palestine, sparsely settled by Jews at the time, was radically changed as a result.
I lived in Palestine from 1933 to 1936, and we saw every week transports of German Jews coming to settle in Palestine. Many new professions were introduced by them into the country, and they played a leading role in making Palestine then a more advanced and progressive country.
Israel is really what it is because of the foundation laid by the Eastern European group, and then the lift toward an educated and well-organized government that came with the immigration of the German Jewish group.
Signed on August 25, 1933, The Haavara Agreement acted much like the Hanotea Agreement. The Anglo-Palestine Bank, under the direction of the Jewish Agency, facilitated the immigration of German Jews to Palestine. In giving up their goods to Germany before departure, the assets would be sent forward to Palestine as German exports. Head of the Jewish Agency and main proponent of the Haavara Agreement, Chaim Arlasarov, from the northern Ukrainian oblast of Romny. Arlasarov was a socialist, an editor of Die Arbeit, or The Labor, and author of the treatise Jewish People's Socialism. He believed in ancient biblical agricultural tradition, such as the Sabbath year and the year of Jubilee, and his treatise led to a resurgence of the Hebrew language. He and close friend, Jewish scientist Chaim Weizmann, worked with the British Mandatory Government in creating a Jewish national home. April 8, 1933, Arlasarov organizes a meeting between Jewish Zionists and Arab leaders of Transjordan, angering more radical Arabs who had criticized Jordan's leader, Emir Abdullah I. Abdullah's father had been part of the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, covered in episode 4, which later led to the Arab revolt against the Ottomans. Abdullah was friendly to Weizmann, Ben-Gurion, and Zionism, and was often seen as a key figure in resolving disputes amongst Arab leaders. He preferred the idea of a Jewish state to the nationalist Arab scion Amin al-Husseini, a direct descendant of Muhammad. He was appointed the top Sunni cleric position of Grand Mufti in 1921 by British High Commissioner of Jerusalem, Herbert Samuel, a position he used to promote Islam and Arab nationalism over Zionism, a position given to him by a Jew. Jews were also opposed to this meeting, in particular the religious Zionist Mizrahi, who demanded that Arlasarov resign. When the Germans responded with their Jewish boycott in April of 1933, many Jews were unable to leave without a special exit visa. Arlasarov worked with High Commissioner and Zionist sympathizer Arthur Wackel to gain access to supplementary exit visas. The Haavara Agreement is rarely discussed in universities because it depicts a very different relationship history, one of economic cooperation between anti-fascist forces and the Reich during the time of a worldwide boycott of the very same Reich. However, many Jewish groups refused to participate, either because many Jewish firms happened to be the business agents of German enterprises, or because some Jewish organizations, namely those in the United States, took up the position that it was unpatriotic to organize a boycott against a country with whom one's country maintained normal trade relations. This may have been true, but the fact remains, it was the Zionists who were the first to break their own boycott. And had this fact been known worldwide, it most certainly would have painted the German regime in a much different light. As Director General of the Anglo-Palestine Bank, Dutch Zionist Eliezer Hoofien prepared the monetary system and issued currency. The Haavara Agreement is often referred to as the Hoofien Agreement, and many of these agreements worked much like the Hanotea. From Klaus Polkehn, the secret contacts. The Hanotea bought the German goods that it required, paying for them from the German bank accounts of Jewish immigrants. The immigrants then left Germany and received the equivalent value of the payments in real estate. In the words of lawyer and Prussian advisor, Dr. Kurt Ball-Kaduri. The Haavara Agreement was concluded in the form of a letter addressed to Herr Hoofien by the Reich Ministry of the Economy. The negotiations were carried out in a smooth way as the Nazis were at the time still Zionist inclined. This agreement resulted in the formation of two companies, Haavara Company in Tel Aviv and Paltrow in Berlin. The Jewish immigrant would pay a sum of roughly 1,000 pounds sterling into a German Haavara account, either at Wassermann Bank in Berlin, founded by Bavarian Jewish merchant scion Oscar Wassermann, also a founder and president of Keren HaYesod, or the Palestine Foundation Fund, the major finance arm of the World Zionist Organization. Wassermann was a Federal Reserve member, along with partner from Kuhn & Loeb and Company Felix Warburg, whose bank handled the Jewish immigrant funds as well. Ultimately, the transfer of over 60,000 Jews and well over $100 million in wealth made their way to the British Mandate of Palestine, a fact rarely taught in schools and a controversial topic even amongst prominent Jews at the time. such as Abba Hillel Silver, and American Jewish Congress President, Rabbi Stephen Wise, who was leading much of the anti-German boycott movement and rattling the sabers of war.
Hitler demanded one concession for the transfer agreement, that the call for a boycott of the Reich, raised by Jews here and elsewhere, be rejected by the Zionists. The Zionists made that concession. And so, while Nazis were marching in Germany, and while Jews were marching here, diplomacy was running a more important story. In the Mediterranean, where the dream of a nation-state for Jewish people came a step closer to reality. The story in this book some will find hard to accept.
On June 16, 1933, the leader of the Jewish agency, Chaim Arlosoroff, was killed, 2 days after returning from negotiations with Germany, irritating relations with Zionists even further. A Russian Jewish revisionist and supporter of Zeev Jabotinsky's revisionist opposition party was charged with the plotting of the murder. 2 others were charged with the actual murder, which is the subject of multiple theories. Abraham Stavsky and Zeev Rosenblatt Stavsky were convicted, but after outspoken support from Chief Rabbi of Palestine, Rav Kook, his conviction was overturned. Kook's influence also reached America when he traveled there in 1924 with Rabbi Moshe Mordecai Epstein of the Slobodka Yeshiva, one of the highest schools of study for Talmud. After Stavsky's conviction, he went on to work with the Zionist paramilitary organization Irgun and was later killed during an exchange with IDF forces in the Atalena affair, 15 years and 5 days after Arlosoroff's murder, and only 50 yards from Arlosoroff's murder location. Police Commissioner and former head of the Arms Procurement Department for Mossad Le'aliyah Bet, Yeshuda Arazi, otherwise known as Joseph Tannenbaum, was the investigating officer, a man with years of experience himself smuggling arms for the Haganah into Palestine from Europe, and who would later be investigated for his involvement in the 1946 ambush of Aliyah Bet vessels, known as the La Spezia Affair. Arazi contended that Stavsky did not kill Arlosoroff, despite the clear identification of him. Instead, Arazi declared that Arabs had done it. Jabotinsky demanded a search for the said Arabs, only to be accused of German collaboration by David Ben-Gurion, who later founded the State of Israel. Zionists created their own shipping and passenger lines by purchasing the Hochstein and naming it the Tel Aviv, and later establishing the American-Palestine Line. The line's president, Jacob S. Strahl, municipal judge and first chairman of the American Jewish Congress, and the man responsible for introducing Karen Hayasad to the United States. The Tel Aviv bore Hebrew letters on the stern and flew the swastika at the mast. One passenger wrote, "The captain of the ship leading was a registered member of the Nazi Party." The Haavara Agreement worked against the boycott and allowed the German economy a market at a time when they had been experiencing economic ruin. In Palestine, there was essentially no German boycott, while the rest of the world, especially world Jewry, had fought so hard to stifle German exports. This led to an expanded audience to Zionism and assured that founding immigrants would be more well off, as only the elite could afford the 1,000 sterling. In Palestine, a massive economic boom occurred, while working-class German Jews would be left to their own devices. Dr. Karl Landem, Dr. Arnold Barth, Herbert Forder, and more poured into Palestine, bringing big industry, oil prospecting, cement, electricity, the Noemi Bank, all on approval from the Reich. A prospect that many in the National Socialist regime would regret. The main advantages of the Haavara Agreement are the following. The influence of the Haavara Group in Palestine has led to the unusual but hoped-for contingency, wherein of all places, Palestine is the country in which German goods are not boycotted by the Jewish side. There is no doubt that the Haavara procedure has made the greatest contribution to the tremendously rapid building of Palestine. However, these concerns were not shared by the SS or Gestapo, nor did they appear to be by Hitler. An initiative should be undertaken for the overdue cancellation of the Haavara Agreement. Hitler stated that the Haavara Agreement would continue. His stance would remain, despite the objection of numerous party officials. According to Swiss Jewish journalist John Kimmich, Hitler with unambiguous determination, ordered the promotion of mass immigration to Palestine. Jewish emigration should be further promoted by all available means. There can thus be no question about the Führer's opinion that such emigration should be, above all, channeled towards Palestine. Winfried Martini wrote that the reports were rather clearly favorable to the Jewish side. Hitler thus remained the guarantor of the Haavara transfer, which was only halted at the outbreak of the Second World War. Like many Zionists, Dr. Kurt Tückler, a German Jewish judge and member of the Zionist Federation, saw opportunity in the emigration process. He enlisted the help of Leopold von Mildenstein, a writer and SS officer in charge of the Jewish desk in security service, known for his flair for journalism. The two traveled to Israel with their wives in an effort to create a travel story that would influence others to move there. He described the agriculture, the draining of the swamps, and the Zionist way of life. Joseph Goebbels was pleased with Mildenstein's narrative and even published 12 articles from him in Der Angriff, or the attack. As part of this project, a series of small brass coins featuring the Seal of Solomon and the caption, "A Nazi Travels to Palestine." The other side features a swastika with the newspaper's name, Angriff. The coins were used as a promotion, a free gift to anyone who purchased a subscription. A Nazi Travels to Palestine received little to no public scrutiny. According to Martini, Mildenstein was directly advised by the Zionist officials. Mildenstein's appointment was likely no accident either, as his department was what later became the Internal Secret Service. SS publication Das Schwarze Korps, which regularly condemned Jews, Catholicism, and Freemasonry, printed, "The time may not be far distant when Palestine once again receives the sons whom it lost 1,000 years ago. Our wishes, along with the goodwill of the state, accompany them." This quote shows even further that the pro-Zionist stance was not unique to von Mildenstein, but largely funded and endorsed by the Reich. Beyond Mildenstein, Zionist leaders continued to advise German intelligence, with little information more than that known to the public. One of the few documents is a memorandum from Professor Franz Six, dated June 17, 1937. It is simply marked "Secret Matter for the Command." It contained information on a visit from Zionist emissary Feivel Polks after his travels to Berlin in early 1937. Like von Mildenstein, Six was a member of the Nazi Party and a member of the SD, the intelligence agency of the SS and Nazi Party. He was expected to be the next commander and would have been in charge of the famed Black Book, or special search list Great Britain obtained, full of names to be arrested, including politicians and celebrities like Winston Churchill, Sigmund Freud, Bertrand Russell, and bankers like Bernard Baruch, a New York agent for the Rothschilds. A separate list included groups such as Freemasons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and the Boy Scouts. He was sentenced to 20 years at Nuremberg, but released a few years later. Not one Zionist appeared eager to expose him. He went on to work for the Gehlen organization, which later became the Internal Secret Service. Later retired and worked as an ad executive for Porsche. On February 4, 1936, a man named David Frankfurter assassinated a prominent member of the Nazi Party, Wilhelm Gustloff, in Switzerland. Frankfurter turned himself in and stated that he acted alone, to the disbelief of the Nazis, who assumed he was working with a larger group. They enlisted the help of an agent of Haganah, Feivel Polks, who promised to help lead to the organization responsible for the murder of Gustloff. This aid became a working relationship, which led to Polks eventually bringing SS Untersturmführer Adolf Eichmann to Palestine. Polks had been recommended to the Reich by Dr. Franz Reichert of the German New Bureau. The interview was conducted by Eichmann and recorded by Six. Polks stated that he was willing to assist Germany as long as it did not conflict with his Zionist views. He stated that he knew who was behind Gustloff's murder and that he could help the Germans in obtaining oil from the Middle East. The Nazi Jewish Department wanted information on murder threats and plans from a group known as the Alliance Israélite Universelle, a largely Freemasonic group formed after the fall of the Second French Empire by Freemason Adolphe Crémieux. Polks would receive regular payments of 1,000 Reichsmarks. Nazi intelligence seemed more interested in preventing assassination than preventing movements towards Palestine. Polks met again with the SS, this time in Haifa, with SS Sturmbannführer Herbert Hagen, under the guise of being journalists, but were expelled to Cairo. Eichmann was captured by Israelis in Argentina in 1960 and stood trial. He was executed in 1962. Polk's archives, which were held at Jerusalem's Yad Vashem Holocaust Center, have not been released because of fear of embarrassment, according to Trotskyist writer Lenny Brenner, who tried to access them as stated in his book, 51 Documents. Hagen succeeded Mildenstein as director of the Judenreferat, and he claimed in his papers that Polks held leadership of the whole self-defense apparatus of the Palestinian Jews. As for Officer Leopold von Mildenstein, a 1956 CIA report from Cairo confirmed that he had been working for the Egyptian government of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the one to nationalize the Suez Canal, sparking the Israeli invasion known as the Suez Crisis. Mildenstein was working on a radio show called Voice of the Arabs and had become one of the biggest broadcasters in the Middle East. By June of 1960, when Eichmann was captured by Mossad, Mildenstein revealed that he had also been working with the CIA and claimed immunity from prosecutions. The CIA would neither confirm nor deny. In 2011, Israeli director Arnon Goldfinger, along with a grandson of Dr. Kurt Tückler, created a documentary entitled The Flat. Goldfinger says that Mildenstein joined the Ministry of Propaganda under Joseph Goebbels and even worked for Coca-Cola in West Germany. There was concern in the Reich that a Jewish homeland in Palestine would create for Germany a new enemy, one that would have a deep influence on developments in the Near East. Other agencies warned that a Jewish state would work to bring special minority protection to every Jew in every country, therefore giving legal protection to the exploitation activity of world Jewry. Hitler's foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, called it dangerous, adding that it would bring an international increase in power to world Jewry. Despite personally reviewing these warnings, Hitler proceeded. To Hitler, the idea of ridding Germany of its Jews far outweighed the risk. By 1937, the British government imposed more restrictions on Jewish immigration to Palestine. The SS responded by working with Zionist agency Mossad LaElia Bet to smuggle Jews illegally into Palestine. The Haavara Agreement brought in untold millions into Palestine from Germany, but what it also achieved was a discerning mass migration. Only the wealthiest and most intelligent were able to migrate. Hitler reviewed the policy in 1937, again in 1938, each time maintaining the agreement. The Reich even contributed by organizing their own transfer company, the International Trade of Investment Agency, or Intria, but even this was managed from London by director Siegfried Moses. Dozens of companies, like Haavara, tens of thousands of Jews, millions in wealth. Jewish historian Edwin Black. Many of these people, especially in the late 1930s, were allowed to transfer actual replicas of their homes and factories. Indeed, rough replicas of their very existence. By means of a transfer agreement, Hitler's Third Reich did more than any other government to support the Jewish transfer to Palestine. The Zionist revisionist writers and scholars often claim that Eichmann was there to conspire with Arab rebels and even meet with Grand Mufti Mohammed Amin al-Husseini. But this story came from Zionist Simon Wiesenthal, writer and eventual member of the American Office of Strategic Services, or OSS. Wiesenthal made the additional claim that Eichmann had a network of Palestinian agents. This version would show up in later years, like in Gerald Reitlinger's The Final Solution. Perhaps it was this crucial but conflicting narrative that led the Israelis to try Eichmann away from the public eye. The reports of Eichmann and Hagen's travels contain renderings of the conversations had with Polks and not the Grand Mufti on October 10th and 11th at Cairo's Café Gropi. Here, Polks explained that a Zionist state must be established by all means, adding that it should be in line with England's partial promises. Then the borders may be pushed further outwards, according to one's wishes. Polkehn went on to applaud Germany's anti-Semitic sentiment. Nationalist Jewish circles expressed their great joy over the radical German policy towards the Jews, as this policy would increase the Jewish population in Palestine, so that one can reckon with a Jewish minority in Palestine over the Arabs in the foreseeable future. According to Eichmann's report, the strategy was to arouse hostility amongst the fascists against the Arab nationalists, as the Pan-Islamic World Congress was set to occur in Berlin. The second point was to note that the main opponents of the fascists were the German communists, who had been broadcasting illegal communist propaganda from a lorry traveling along the German-Luxembourg border. After months of cooperation, Mossad had taken up operations in the House of the Reich Union with the regime's permission. Pina Ginsburg and Moshe Auerbach were two agents that met with the Gestapo and arranged for the expansion of illegal immigration to Palestine against the will of the British Mandate. By the summer of 1938, Eichmann had the collaboration of Mossad and Bar Gilead, setting up training camps for immigrants to prepare for their work in Palestine. These Jews from Palestine spoke a language not totally different from that of Eichmann. They had been sent to Europe by the communal settlements in Palestine, and they were not interested in rescue operations. That was not their job. They wanted to select suitable material, and their chief enemies were not those who made life impossible for Jews in the old countries, Germany and Austria, but those who barred access to the new homeland. That enemy was definitely Britain, not Germany. They were probably among the first Jews to talk openly about mutual interests. While the Labor Party Zionists like Weizmann, Wise, and Ben-Gurion secretly kept their contacts with fascists, the revisionist groups of Irgun and Leomi openly lauded them, all lining up to work with Hitler, while publicly denouncing their opponents of the very same thing. Italian dictator Benito Mussolini supported the revisionists and allowed them to train his navy. At one point, Jabotinsky suggested the mandate go to Italy because Mussolini would have been far more aggressive. Perhaps the most decisive piece of evidence for collaboration between the Third Reich and the Zionists is a memorandum from January 11, 1941, which reads as a proposal from the Irgun, offering Germany support as an ally. This extended into the military, involving Jewish manpower. 2 years later, Irgun forces would be attacking British installations, weakening the anti-Hitler alliance. In June of 1938, 32 capitalist countries convened in the Swiss town of Evian to address the Jewish question. This was initiated by U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Israeli politician Golda Meir was allowed to attend, but was not permitted to speak. In the end, all countries decided not to take in any Jewish refugees, apart from the Dominican Republic. It would seem logical that at a time when international Jewry was calling for worldwide boycotts and even war over the Germans' supposed mistreatment of the Jews, that the Zionist Committee would pressure these nations to take them in, or that these 32 nations would see the impending danger for which this conference was called. Instead, the Zionist leaders tabled a motion for the admission of 1.2 million Jews to Palestine at the beginning of the conference. These leaders were only interested in the selective Jews, and if the danger were truly real, then the same Zionists are responsible for the failure to rescue a much greater number of Jews. They looked on the whole thing with indifferent hostility from the very beginning. The truth of the matter was that what was being attempted in Evian in no way conformed with the idea of Zionism. If Adolf Hitler were truly hell-bent on Jewish genocide, this was the ideal time to save them. Nearly 1.2 million of them. 32 nations had this opportunity. 32 declined.
German cities will be subjected to an ordeal the like of which has never been experienced by a country in continuity, severity, or magnitude. To achieve this end, there are no lengths of violence to which we will not go.
Most films, books, and articles, as well as academic lectures and material, offer the perspective that the beginning of the Second World War started with Adolf Hitler's invasion of Poland, an act of aggression, unprovoked, the beginning of Hitler's worldwide conquest. Historian Richard J. Evans wrote, in 1934, when Hitler had concluded a 10-year non-aggression pact with the Poles, it had seemed possible that Poland might become a satellite state in a future European order dominated by Germany. But by 1939, it had become a serious obstacle to the eastward expansion of the Third Reich. It therefore had to be wiped from the map and ruthlessly exploited to finance preparations for the coming war in the West. But if these same historians were willing to offer their perspective of the rest of the world, would this tale be told differently? March 30, 1939. Polish army officer and foreign minister Józef Beck, who had been struggling to keep peace with not only Germany, but Lithuania and Czechoslovakia, was granted assurance from the British government that they would assist Poland as an ally in wartime if Poland felt a threat to their own independence. In the words of British Secretary Lord Halifax Neville Chamberlain, I now have to inform the House that in the event of any action which clearly threatened Polish independence and which the Polish government accordingly considered it vital to resist with their national forces, His Majesty's government would feel themselves bound at once to lend the Polish government all support in their power. They have given the Polish government an assurance to that effect. This assurance resulted in widespread violence against the German minorities in Poland and agitated the already contested Danzig and Korda region. From Hans Schadewaldt's Polish acts of atrocity against the German minority in Poland, the guarantee of assistance given Poland by the British government was the agent which lent impetus to Britain's policy of encirclement. It was designed to exploit the problem of Danzig and the corridor to begin a war, desired and long prepared by England for the annihilation of Greater Germany. In Warsaw, moderation was no longer considered necessary, and the opinion held was that matters could be safely brought to a head. England was backing this diabolical game, having guaranteed the integrity of the Polish state. The British assurance of assistance meant that Poland was to be the battering ram of Germany's enemies. Henceforth, Poland neglected no form of provocation of Germany and, in its blindness, dreamt of victorious battle at Berlin's gates, had it not been for the encouragement of the English war clique, which was stiffening Poland's attitude towards the Reich and whose promises led Warsaw to feel safe. The Polish government would hardly have let matters develop to the point where Polish soldiers and civilians would eventually interpret the slogan to extirpate all German influence as an incitement to the murder and bestial mutilation of human beings. In 1939, there were more than 1 million ethnic Germans living in Poland. By August of that year, Polish authorities began a campaign of mass arrests, confiscating businesses and welfare institutions. Many of these Germans had already lost everything, including land, after the punishing Treaty of Versailles, which devastated Germany, and in this case, reduced their forces to a mere 100,000 soldiers. The Germans who were arrested were forced to march further inland. Due to the agreement with the British, the Polish would treat these Germans as hostages who were to be punished with impunity. Donald Day from the Chicago Tribune. I traveled up to the Polish corridor where the German authorities permitted me to interview the German refugees from many Polish cities and towns. The story was the same: mass arrests and long marches along roads towards the interior of Poland. The railroads were crowded with troop movements. Those who fell by the wayside were shot. The Polish authorities seemed to have gone mad. I have been questioning people all my life, and I think I know how to make deductions for the exaggerated stories told by people who have passed through harrowing personal experiences. But even with generous allowance, the situation was plenty bad. To me, the war seemed only a question of hours. More than 80,000 Germans forced to leave Poland, a home which had been theirs to begin with. British Ambassador Neville Henderson warned that war would be an inevitable conclusion if these atrocities didn't cease, and if negotiations were unsuccessful. He also warned Halifax that a full-scale occupation of Danzig would be unwise and against Polish policy. What he did not know was that the policy of Halifax would require the destruction of Germany.
Mr. Churchill, hat er zu ihm wieder erklärt, dass er den Krieg will. Er hat nun vor etwa 6 Wochen mit dem Krieg in dem Raum begonnen, in dem er anscheinend glaubt, wohl besonders stark zu sein, nämlich den Luftkrieg gegen die Zivilbevölkerung. Allerdings unter dem vorgeschobenen Motto gegen sogenannte kriegswichtige Einrichtungen. Diese Einrichtungen sind seit Freiburg offene Städte, Marktflecken, Bauerndörfer, Wohnhäuser, Lazarette, Schulen, Kindergärten und was sonst noch alles getroffen wird. Ich habe bisher darauf kaum antworten lassen. Aber das soll nun nicht bedeuten, dass dies die einzige Antwort ist oder bleiben wird. Ich bin mir nun darüber im Klaren, dass aus dieser unserer einmal kommenden Antwort namenloses Leid und Unglück über die Menschen hereinbrechen wird. Natürlich nicht über Herrn Churchill, denn er wird dann sicherlich in Kanada sitzen, dort wohin man ja das Vermögen und die Kinder der vornehmsten Kriegsinteressenten schon gebracht hat. Aber es wird für Millionen andere Menschen ein großes Leid entstehen. Und Herr Churchill sollte mir dieses Mal vielleicht ausnahmsweise glauben, wenn ich als Prophet jetzt Folgendes ausspreche. Es wird dadurch ein großes Weltreich zerstört werden. Ein Weltreich, das zu vernichten und auch nur zu schädigen, niemals meine Absicht war. Allein ich bin mir darüber im Klaren, dass die Fortführung dieses Kampfes nur mit der vollständigen Zertrümmerung des einen der beiden Kämpfenden enden wird. Wie der Churchill mag glauben, das ist Deutschland nicht, ich weiß, es wird England sein.
Many of these reports of violence against the Germans were considered simple propaganda, but Hitler was in a unique situation. If he did not act, the German citizens of Danzig would suffer, and if he did, it could start war with the French and the British. American historian Harry Elmer Barnes. It has now been irrefutably established on a documentary basis that Hitler was no more responsible for war in 1939 than the Kaiser was in 1914, if indeed as responsible. Hitler's responsibility in 1939 was far less than that of Beck in Poland, Halifax in England, or even Daladier in France. Dutch historian Louis de Jong wrote about windows being smashed in homes, shops, embassies, and schools. Polish newspaper Ilustrowany even announced that Poland was instigating action against Germany. Another Polish publication, Kurier Polski, called for the destruction of Germany, even while negotiations were ongoing. These negotiations, led by Polish ambassador Jerzy Potocki, were deteriorating as he failed to persuade Beck. Poland prefers Danzig to peace. Even British Royal Navy Captain Russell Grenfell was wary of Britain's unconditional support for Poland. This would have worked out very awkwardly for Britain in the days when she was the challenging power, as for example against Spain in the 16th century, Holland in the 17th, and Spain and France in the 18th. He further wrote that the guarantee publicly dares a rival to ignore the guarantee and take away the consequences, after which it is hardly possible for that rival to endeavor to seek a peaceful solution of its dispute with the guaranteed country without appearing to be submitting to blackmail. Pictured is the written discharge of German Eugene Hoffmann of Bromberg, who was imprisoned by Jewish-Polish commander Isidor Berger. This same discharge was received by all German minority prisoners to be released at the same time as Hoffmann. However, on September 4, all except Hoffmann were murdered, 39 Germans killed and mutilated. Poland wants war with Germany, and Germany will not be able to avoid it, even if it wishes to do so. September 1st, 1939. German forces intervened for a desperate German minority, crossing the border at Bromberg, which had been annexed to Poland after 1918. On September 3rd, England and France declared war on Germany. The Polish would be invaded 2 weeks later by forces from the USSR, yet no declaration was declared by either country or any of their allies. Poland, England, and France wanted Germany, and now they had them. What followed was a complete genocidal slaughter on the German citizens of Bromberg. The Bromberg Bloody Sunday. Historians are quick to point out that this was a German act of aggression, German sniper fire on retreating soldiers. But historical context shows that Poland was doing anything but retreating, and the Germans were in no position to provoke. In and near Bromberg, thousands of Germans were hunted and killed by gangs of Poles. Even Polish priests were not only encouraging the extermination, but issuing weapons, torture, and mutilation across the city. Bodies lay about everywhere, many of them still bound or shackled. Over 5,000 murdered, according to the official number, but some historians contend this figure. At the Protestant New Cemetery in Bromberg alone lay more than 900 Germans killed. The Central Graves Registry Office of Posen estimates 15,000, same as Social Democratic publisher Otto Heike. All of this took place before the war, which was to come, a series of heinous atrocities. The Poles have lost the last feeling of moderation and proportion. Every foreigner who looks at the new maps in Poland, on which a large part of Germany, as far as the proximity of Berlin, as well as Bohemia, Moravia, and Slovakia, and a gigantic part of Russia, are already annexed in the quite fertile imagination of Poles, must think that Poland has become a gigantic lunatic asylum. The further you go into Poland, the more you find pillage and murder. This nation of peasants inclines to drink, quarrel, abuse, and murder. It would be hard to find so many murderers in any other nation. The minorities in Poland are to disappear, and it is Polish policy that they shall not disappear only on paper. This policy is being pushed forward ruthlessly and without the slightest regard for public opinion abroad, for international treaties, and for the League of Nations. The Ukraine under Polish rule is an inferno. White Russia is an even more hellish inferno. The purpose of Polish policy is the disappearance of the national minorities, both on paper and in reality. A wave of terror is sweeping Poland at this very moment. The press can hardly breathe a word because it is gagged. A police regime with all its horrors and its wild measures of oppression strangles the country. The prisons of the Republic today hold more than 3,000 political criminals who are maltreated by their jailers, humiliated and beaten up with belts and sticks. The lives they have to stand is such that in many prisons the inmates prefer death to the slow torture inflicted upon them. The first victims of the war were Volksdeutsche, ethnic German civilians, residents in and citizens of Poland, using lists prepared years earlier, in part by lower administrative offices. Poland immediately deported 15,000 Germans to eastern Poland. Fear and rage at the quick German victories led to hysteria. German spies were seen everywhere, suspected of forming a fifth column. More than 5,000 German civilians were murdered in the first days of the war. They were hostages and scapegoats at the same time. Gruesome scenes were played out in Bromberg on September 3rd, as well as in several other places throughout the province of Posen, in Pomerelien, wherever German minorities resided. In an effort to reach a peaceful solution, Hitler was prepared to rescind parts of Poland and restore sovereignty in Czechoslovakia. But his attempt was thwarted by Joseph Stalin, by way of Vyacheslav Molotov, who had received information about the peace deal from German Minister of Foreign Affairs Joachim von Ribbentrop. They refused, and Hitler would abandon the idea of Polish statehood.
Ich muss aber auch erwähnen, dass neben der von uns zugegebenen Tapferkeit vieler polnischer Verbände die schmutzigsten Taten stehen, die vielleicht in den letzten Jahrzehnten irgendwo vorgefallen sind. Es sind Dinge, die ich als Soldat des Weltkrieges, der ich nur im Westen gekämpft habe, nie kennenzulernen Gelegenheit hatte. Tausende von niedergemetzelten Volksdeutschen, viehisch abgeschlachteten Frauen, Mädchen und Kindern. Unzählige deutsche Soldaten und Offiziere, die als Verwundet in die Hände dieses Gegners gefallen sind. Sie wurden massakriert, Augen ausgestochen, bestialisch verstümmelt. Und das Schlimmste, diese polnische Regierung hat das in ihrem eigenen Rundfunk ganz offen zugegeben. Es gab wirklich Momente, da man sich sagen musste, soll man unter diesen Umständen sich selbst noch irgendeine Beschränkung auferlegen? Es ist mir nicht bekannt geworden, dass irgendeiner unserer demokratischen Staatsmänner es der Mühe wert gefunden hat, gegen diese Barbareien zu protestieren. Zehntausende werden verschleppt, misshandelt, in der grausamsten Weise getötet. Sadistische Bestien lassen ihre perversen Instinkte aus. Und diese demokratische, fromme Welt sieht zu, ohne mit einer Wimper zu zucken. Es war sehr schwer, sich hier in der Gewalt zu behalten. Ich möchte aber hier gleich betonen, man soll sich auch hier wieder nicht in den demokratischen Staaten einbilden, dass das ewig so sein muss. Wenn man es anders haben will, dann kann man es auch anders haben.
Even Neville Henderson, who had worked for peace at this time, would later claim that Hitler had initiated the violence, even though he had previously warned of the very atrocities that Hitler had been forced to stop. A narrative that continues to this day. A narrative that does tell of an event that same day when passenger liner SS Athenia, heading for Canada from England, was sunk. On board, 500 Jewish, 469 Canadian, 311 American, 72 British, and 315 crew members. As the Athenia made their way off the Irish coast, they were spotted by the German submarine U-30. They were later fired upon. According to U-boat commander Fritz Julius Lemp, the boat had strayed from shipping lanes and was darkened, prompting the attack. Many were rescued, but 98 passengers and 19 crew members were killed by an explosion resulting from the fired torpedo. 3 Royal Navy destroyers, HMS Electra, HMS Escort, and HMS Fame, were the first on the scene to rescue passengers. The British blamed the Germans. Joseph Goebbels claimed that a bomb may have been planted by Churchill. With Britain and France now at war with Germany, it would have seemed unwise to needlessly attack a passenger liner with 3 Royal Navy destroyers nearby. And although the media reported Goebbels' claim as ludicrous, the idea was actually a bit more plausible. Hitler was doing his best to avoid confrontation and had ordered U-boat commanders to abide by the prize regulations, which forbade an attack like this, but did demand that these ships be searched. If found to be containing war aid, the ships could be sunk and the crews could escape safely, a much likelier scenario. It would not be until the Nuremberg trials that a statement read by Admiral Karl Donitz would claim that the attack was an error and that the Germans attempted to cover it up. The US had taken the public stance of neutrality, while Germany maintained that the attack was sabotage, meant to provoke America into joining the war effort, seeing as 30 Americans had been killed. The US State Department requested that surviving passengers submit affidavits detailing their experiences. Most claimed that they saw nothing. A few claimed that U-boats fired upon them. But one passenger had a different perspective. Gustav Anderson from Evanston, Illinois, a travel bureau operator who had traveled on the Athenia enough to know much of the crew by name. His affidavit asserted that the liner was carrying defense materials and weapons to Canada and was scheduled to be outfitted as a raider vessel. Anderson swore under oath and was questioned by Congress, stating that he had spoken with Athenia Chief Officer Barnett Copeland, who had given him the information that the ship was to be used as an armed merchant cruiser. Anderson said that the ship's decks had been reinforced and that this was common knowledge amongst passengers, a majority of them Jews. Anderson went on to say that the Athenia was sunk by gunfire from the British destroyers just before sunrise. If the liner had indeed been carrying munitions, it most certainly would have been a legitimate target for the Germans, and even more importantly, avoided a war. Chief Officer Copeland denied these claims. Others would too, but not until after Anderson's story had reached the press. The New York Times would be one of the first to offer a counter-narrative, and a number of other affidavits appeared, now countering Anderson's recollection. But public skepticism had reached overseas, and only a month later, roughly 40% of Americans polled were not convinced that Germany had committed the attack. In the Army and Navy Journal, former President Herbert Hoover wrote, The whole thing looks suspicious to me. I cannot believe even the clumsy Germans would do such a thing. Anderson went on to give numerous lectures of his account, and the British spent a considerable amount of effort to dispel this very account. This led many Americans to question why the British would go to such lengths to silence or counter Anderson if the story were simply not true. But American media would pursue story after story to the contrary. As one of the rescue vessels, City of Flint, made their way to Halifax, Nova Scotia, the ship's captain, Joseph Gaynard, blocked Anderson's effort to make contact with the New York newspaper to give his account. His version was largely told as sensational, and later it was claimed that he had worked as a spy for Idaho Republican Senator William Borah, a descendant of Catherine von Bora, a man who rejected the Treaty of Versailles and the U.S. entry into the League of Nations. Winston Churchill became the first Lord of the Admiralty on September 3, 1939, the very same day as the mysterious sinking of the Athenia.
This was one of the basic problems that Churchill had in the war years, persuading the Americans to come in and fight his war for him. Because by 1940 it had become Churchill's war. It was no longer concerned with Poland. Poland was forgotten as soon as Poland was defeated. The war by 1940 had become a matter of self-prolongation. It had become important for Churchill's own political reign that the war continue.
In March of 1938, the Austrian banking baron, Louis Nathaniel de Rothschild, was arrested at the airport in Aspern. It was reported that he would be held until he made good of the losses of the Kreditanstalt, which was the largest bank in Austria. That is, until it failed in 1931. Rothschild had been the president. He was held on a $10 million ransom at the Hotel Metropole in Vienna. Later, he was released after a payment of $21 million, the largest ransom payment for any individual in history. On the 6th of July, 1938, Winston Churchill expressed his anger at the arrest and even lamented that Jewish ladies were being forced to clean the streets, but his feelings about Germany were clear. Germany's most unforgivable crime before the Second World War was her attempt to extricate her economic power from the world's trading system and to create her own exchange mechanism, which would deny finance its opportunity to profit. It was not a secret that Churchill wanted to agitate Germany and had planned not only a second, but a third world war for years. Much of this was stated in a collection of his own essays entitled Step by Step, written from 1936 to 1939. They suggest a hatred of European Renaissance and a strong desire for an English, American, and Soviet alliance. Churchill and his big banking associates were more interested in their Far East investments, which largely consisted of the opium and drug trade. And he even mockingly stated that the influx of opium and missionaries have done nothing but good for China. Churchill was highly critical of the Jews, but at the same time appeared to have a fondness for them, some close friends, such as Major General Sir Edward Louis Spears. Even Winston had a fault. He was too fond of the Jews. Although Churchill had plenty of criticism for the Jewish people, he seemed more interested in helping Jewish financiers get their war, while at the same time destroying the resurging German economy that was occurring under Hitler and the National Socialist regime. He was keenly aware of who was responsible. The same phenomenon has been presented in Germany, so far as this madness has been allowed to prey upon the temporary prostration of the German people. Although in all these countries there are many non-Jews every whit as bad as the worst of the Jewish revolutionaries, the part played by the latter in proportion to their numbers is astonishing. But Churchill's supposed love-hate relationship with the Jews was a much more prolific one than meets the eye.
After all, my friends, only a few hours away by air, there dwells a nation of nearly 70 millions, of the most educated, industrious, scientific, disciplined people in the world, who are being taught from childhood to think of war as a glorious exercise, and death in battle as the noblest fate for man. There is a nation which has abandoned all its liberties in order to augment its collective strength. There is a nation which, with all its strength and virtue, is in the grip of a group of ruthless men preaching a gospel of intolerance and racial pride, unrestrained by law, by parliament, or by public opinion. In that country, all pacifist speeches, all morbid war books are forbidden or suppressed, and their authors rigorously imprisoned. From their new table of commandments, they have omitted, "Thou shalt not kill." It is but 20 years since these neighbors of ours fought almost the whole world and almost defeated them. Now they are rearming with the utmost speed, and ready to their hands is this new lamentable weapon of the air, against which our navy is no defense, and before which women and children, the weak and frail, the pacifist and the jingo, the warrior and the civilian, the frontline trenches and the cottage home, all lie in equal and impartial peril. Nay, worse still, for with the new weapon has come a new method, or rather has come back the most brutish method of ancient barbarism, namely the possibility of compelling the submission of races by terrorizing and torturing their civil populations. And worst of all, the more civilized a country is, the larger and more splendid its cities, the more intricate the structure of its social and economic life, the more is it vulnerable, the more is it at the mercy of those who may make it their prey. Now these are facts, hard, grim, indisputable facts, and in face of these facts, I ask again, what are we to do?
The first political plan for a Jewish homeland in Palestine was written by Colonel Charles Henry Churchill in 1841, 50 years before the father of Zionism, Theodor Herzl. Winston's father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was often mocked for his large Jewish circle of friends, many of whom were part of the Rothschilds' banking dynasty. Jewish merchant banker Ernest Cassell had managed Winston's finances for his life, free of charge. His mother, Jenny Jerome, or Jacobson, was from a wealthy Jewish family. Her father, Leonard Jerome, changed from Jacobson, was a large Jewish shareholder of the New York Times, and at the time was known as the King of Wall Street, and a close friend of the prolific Vanderbilt family. Jenny was part Iroquois and one of the first women in elite society to be tattooed. She had a snake coiled around her left wrist. Churchill benefited from the generosity of rich Jews such as Sir Ernest Cassell, and even joked about Sir Philip Sassoon being the restaurant car attached to his train. His sponging induced grotesque fantasies that he was in the pay of international Jewry. In 1924, Churchill filed a libel suit against Lord Alfred, or Bosie, Douglas, lecturer, poet, son of the Marquess of Queensberry, and lover of poet Oscar Wilde. Douglas claimed that Churchill had falsified a report on the naval battle of Jutland in World War I, when the Royal Navy drove back German fleets. Churchill allegedly reported that it was the British who had been defeated, so that British securities prices would drop, allowing a select group of Jewish financiers to buy them up at cheap prices and allowing Cassell to make up a $40 million profit. Both were cleared. Many suspected that Winston was being controlled by Lord Victor Rothschild, by way of Victor's friend and Soviet spy, Guy Burgess. The reportedly gay Churchill was quite fond of Burgess, who frequented Churchill's home at Chartwell. Many suspected that this was how Winston was being influenced, as Burgess was earning nearly 5 times what his contemporaries made. Burgess was recruited as a Soviet agent in 1934, and by the next year, the Anglo-German Fellowship was formed by Burgess and Colonel John Robert McNamara. British historian John Costello tells of an instance when Burgess, McNamara, a War Office official by the name of Tom Wiley, and J.H. Sharp, the Church of England's Archdeacon for Southern Europe, took a group of boys to a Hitler youth camp, where the boys allegedly satisfied their sexual passion. The trip was sponsored by the Foreign Relations Council of the Church of England. By 1936, Burgess landed a job producing for the BBC. In October of '38, he met Winston Churchill, and later that year joined British MI6. Guy was also a lover of Sir Anthony Blunt, an art historian and Soviet spy, who later confessed to recruiting young students at Cambridge University. Blunt used homosexuality as a way of blackmailing older boys, and later, men. Anthony knew that much of Britain was run by former prefects, vulnerable to blackmail. He contends that Blunt ran a pedophile ring, which included much of the country's elite. Like Churchill, Blunt was close with the banking families, like the Rothschilds and Warburgs, and shared young boys with the head of MI6, Maurice Oldfield. He goes on to write that much of the royal family were not only homosexual, but had an affinity for young boys. This included Edward, Prince of Wales, his brother George, Duke of Kent, the brother to the Queen, David Bowes-Lyon, and Lord Louis Mountbatten, uncle of Prince Philip, and later husband of the granddaughter of Jewish banker Ernest Cassel. In fact, he makes the point that much of the royal family is indeed Jewish. Everywhere you looked, you could see the Jewish influence in Churchill's life. Bernard Baruch, David Ben-Gurion, Chaim Weizmann, Rufus Isaacs, and even Charlie Chaplin. In 1935, Winston Churchill contacted Britain's first film mogul, Alexander Korda, about a script he had written entitled The Reign of George V, and secured a contract as an assistant producer and historical advisor for the film, a film that would later be shelved. But Korda would prove useful, as his rising status allowed him to connect with Hollywood, where he released a successful trilogy of films: Sanders of the River in 1936, The Drum in 1938, and The Four Feathers in 1939. These English westerns did well at the box office, resulting in Hollywood's 1939 response, Gunga Din. Famed aviator and leader of the America First movement, Charles Lindbergh, was outraged at the propaganda films, arguing that America was being enticed into an unnecessary war. The three most important groups who have been pressing this country towards war are the British, the Jewish, and the Roosevelt administration. Lindbergh was plenty aware that the cinemas were a propaganda machine, saying that cinemas soon became filled with plays portraying the glory of war. American author Gore Vidal. The English kept up a propaganda barrage that was to permeate our entire culture. On our screens, it seemed as if the only country on earth was England. British intelligence had no great faith in the American educational system. In May of 1940, Korda was summoned to meet with Duff Cooper, Churchill's Minister of Information. Korda was called to the U.S. to create an American propaganda film. Hollywood at the time was becoming not just a sanctuary for Jewish filmmakers, but a hotbed. Creating a film in Hollywood would create less suspicion for agents and propagandists. That film was That Hamilton Woman, released in March of 1941, featuring Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh, who was now one of the world's biggest stars after appearing in the Oscar-winning Gone with the Wind. The film is set during the Napoleonic Wars. The famous line from Olivier, "You cannot make peace with dictators. You have to destroy them, wipe them out," was a clear analogy to Adolf Hitler. This film, along with another one of Churchill's Jewish friends, Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator, United Artists Foreign Correspondent, and MGM's The Mortal Storm, were films that were used as propaganda and received boycotts from America First, as productions that seemed to be preparing Americans for war. Churchill kept a bust of the movie's character, Admiral Horatio Nelson, on his desk, and named his cat the same thing. In September of 1941, 2 months before Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Senate conducted an investigation into propaganda in motion pictures. Exhibit 1, Alexander Korda. But the real drama was unfolding with Churchill himself. Much of the world's media was portraying Hitler as the dragon, and Churchill as King George. The story of Korda is worth its own film. He was later accused of working for MI6, with payments being shown to British agents in the US. Claude Danzy, deputy chief of MI6, sat on the board of London's films after the war. Winston Churchill knighted him in 1942. Today, the BAFTA, or British Film Award, is given in honor to Korda. Another protege of MI6's Claude Danzy was Ian Fleming, or codename Z, who wrote a series of novels that fascinated Korda, especially 1954's Live and Let Die, featuring the now iconic character James Bond. Had Korda not died in 1956, it may have been him who had directed the film.